In hopes of having a variety of titles for the Master System and Genesis, Sega went to outside software developers in order to license their games. In many cases, Sega would reprogram the games themselves, either in-house or with a company that worked closely with Sega, such as Compile. In many cases, this is how games that were exclusive to Nintendo systems made it to a Sega system. One of those games that Sega licensed was Ghouls N Ghosts from Capcom. Known as Dai Makimura in Japan, the title literally translates to be Great Demon Village. This was a very popular arcade title and the sequel to the game Ghosts and Goblins, which was ported to the NES. At the time, Capcom was making games exclusively for Nintendo in North America, and so Sega would reprogram numerous Capcom games for their systems, including Ghouls N Ghosts, Forgotten Worlds, Strider, Mercs, and Cheeky Cheeky Boys. It wouldn't be until Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition that Capcom would develop their own games for Sega systems. In this video, I'm going to take a look at Ghouls N Ghosts for the Master System, a loose port of the arcade game. Despite making the Genesis version a very close port, this one seems to be redesigned just enough to feel more like a console platformer versus a quarter-eating arcade machine. The changes make the game much easier due to the added gameplay elements. Some people, myself included, might find this a much more accessible entry to the series with welcome changes, while people that want as pure an arcade experience as possible will probably hate it. It's not simply hardware limitations that change the gameplay. This was intentional to make the game accessible to a wider audience on a console reaching the end of its life. Why Sega chose to do this with such a late release is beyond me, but I'm glad they did. I'm not much of a fan of this series due to the difficulty curve. The original games frustrate me, and I generally don't have a very good time playing them. This one, on the other hand, I found enjoyable. Before I look at the similarities and differences of this version to the original, let me provide some background info for those that are unfamiliar with the series. You play as the knight Arthur, and 3 years have passed since the events of Ghosts and Goblins. Lucifer, ruler of the demon realm, steals the souls of everyone in the kingdom, including Princess Prinprin. You're the only one left, and it's your job to defeat Lucifer and return everyone's souls to their bodies. The game is a side-scrolling platformer with 5 stages and a boss fight at the end of every stage. You'll fight all sorts of monsters along the way as you proceed from the graveyard all the way to the demon realm. This game is notoriously difficult, as are all the games in this series. You start with a suit of armor, and one hit destroys your armor. This leaves Arthur mostly naked except for his underwear. One more hit, and you die. The arcade game will let you continue as long as you're willing to give it more quarters. Okay, let's first look at the similarities between the Master System version and the arcade. All 5 levels are here, and they're almost identical to the arcade. There were a few areas where hardware limitations required changes. Things like the spinning fire wheels in level 2 were removed because of this. The levels include the Execution Place, which is a graveyard filled with guillotines. Level 2 is the Village of Decay that literally goes up in flames by the midway point. Baron Rankel's Tower is the next level. This is a vertical auto-scroller where getting crushed means instant death. You'll then proceed to the Crystal Forest, where jumping into the ceilings will cause damage, and then you'll descend across carnivorous plants to the final level, Lucifer's Castle. Here, you'll face the most fearsome creatures the game has to offer. In addition to all the levels being present, all of the enemies are also here. Some bosses, like the Eyeball Cloud, had to be simplified due to hardware constraints, but they're all here nonetheless. Just like the arcade version, the game requires you to complete 2 loops of the game in order to get the true ending. Loop 2 is much more difficult as well, and you'll need a special weapon known as the Psycho Cannon in order to fight the true final boss. Throughout the game, you'll uncover secret treasure chests, usually by walking over or jumping in predetermined spots. Opening the chest will reveal an item such as a weapon, or an evil wizard who will temporarily turn you into a duck if you're wearing armor, or an old man if you're mostly naked. Just like the arcade, whether you get the magician or an item is determined in sequence, and taking a hit will reset the sequence. Almost all of the weapons made it to the Master System. You start with the javelin, and you can pick up the sword, axe, discus, or fireball. The only missing weapon is the large sword that acts as a melee-only weapon. I can't say that I'm upset about that one being excluded. You also have magic spells, but the way they work has been changed. I'll talk about that when I cover the differences. The Master System features all the music tracks from the arcade. Sadly, there's no FM audio option, so it's just the PSG chiptunes. That's actually kind of strange since this game was released in Japan, where the Mark III and Master System console models could play FM audio. Also, Lucifer's theme is in the ROM file, but it's unused during the fight. Finally, when you die, you'll start at the nearest checkpoint. There is a checkpoint at the middle of the stage, and one at the boss of the stage. There are also unlimited continues, though you don't have to put more quarters into your Master System. Unless you really want to. Okay, now let's talk about what's different. First, the game doesn't include the map screen that's a staple of all the games for this series. I think this is because of the cartridge size constraints, but it's still a big disappointment. Also missing is the opening cutscene from the arcade, but the ending cutscene is still here. This is really bizarre, as the Genesis version that Sega reprogrammed is also missing the opening cutscene. Sega also changed the story. Lucifer has been renamed Loki, and instead of stealing the souls of your kingdom, he simply kills the villagers and kidnaps the princess. This somewhat watered-down version is really odd. Sega at the time was trying to make their systems more adult to compete with the family-friendly NES, so I'm not sure why they made these censorship changes. The biggest change, of course, are the gameplay elements. Unlike the 2-hit and you're dead arcade system, this version added a life bar system. You'll start the game with 2 hearts. Every hit you take reduces your hearts by 1. When you're down to 1 heart, you lose your armor, get hit again, and then you're dead. You also have a magic meter that allows you to cast spells. Hitting the pause button on the console will take you to a menu where you can pick a spell. You'll start off with fire and lightning spells. You can only cast magic while you're in armor, but unlike the arcade where you need the gold armor upgrade to cast, any armor will do in this version. Each spell requires a certain amount of magic points to cast, so you are limited in the number of times that you can cast a spell. Your magic will fully recover if you lose a life, or if you find a place to recharge your MP. When I first started the game, it felt very sluggish, almost like the system couldn't handle the game, but it turns out that this was by design. Arthur's walking speed and jumping abilities are incredibly limited in the beginning. You'll have to acquire upgrades to move faster and to jump higher and further. In fact, some areas are nearly impossible without the upgrades. As for the upgrades, you get them through the treasure chests. Instead of an item just appearing, a door will appear. Entering the door will lead you to an old man who offers you one of 3 random items. The items include weapons, armor, helmets, and boots. Weapons are of course self-explanatory, but the other items each upgrade Arthur in different ways. I wonder if this old man is the same one that gave Link the wooden sword in The Legend of Zelda. Arthur starts the game with silver armor, helmet, and boots, and the upgrades are, in order, red, green, then gold. You'll only be offered a particular colored item once you have the previous color, so the green version of an item won't appear until you've acquired the red version, and so on. All of the upgrades are permanent, even if you die or use a continue. It's also impossible to downgrade your items, and there's no reason that you would want to either. Armor determines how many hearts or hit points Arthur has. Each upgrade gives him an extra heart, so once you have the gold armor, you'll be able to take 5 hits before you die. This completely changes the game, as you can tank hits from tough enemies like the little flying red demons, or even bosses. This allowed me to learn the stages and boss patterns a little better, since I could get a lot further and practice the harder areas a lot more. The game is still difficult, but nowhere as brutal as any other version. Boot upgrades will increase Arthur's speed and allow him to jump farther. The red boots make him move more consistent with the arcade version, and by the time you get to the gold boots, Arthur is zipping along like Ryu in a Ninja Gaiden game. This extra speed and jumping ability changes the platforming in ways that makes the game feel more like a run-and-gun. This makes Loop 2 feel like an almost entirely different game than the first Loop. One issue, though, is that Arthur moves very fast in the gold boots to the point that his controls start feeling a little bit slippery, especially if you're rushing through some of the stages. The helmet upgrades give Arthur more magic spells. You'll get a shield spell, a double that follows your movement and attacks as you do, a screen damaging bomb that requires a giant amount of MP. The shield spell is the most effective since it makes you invulnerable for about 10 seconds. I ended up spamming this on bosses, and it might be a little too overpowered for this game. It probably should have costed at least double the MP to cast, since I never really ran out during the stage. There is a final spell, Life, which restores all your health, but it requires the Psycho Cannon to cast and uses your entire MP bar, so it's essentially a one-use spell. Weapon pickups work differently in this version, and I feel it's a welcome addition. Weapon upgrades are in a particular order: lance, sword, axe, discus, then flame. You can't go backwards to a previous weapon, but unlike the other versions, all of the upgrades are useful. The weapons are thrown exactly the same as the arcade, except for the fire, which simply fires straight across the screen instead of in an arc. But each upgrade is stronger than the previous weapon. I didn't realize this until late into the first loop when I picked up the axe, and realized that an enemy on the stage that took 3 hits to kill with the sword now only took 2 hits with the axe. This weapon system is great. At no point did I run into a situation where I had to pick up a weapon or have to kill myself in order to keep the weapon that I wanted, something that happened to me a lot in the arcade version. Just like the arcade, the axe flies in an upward angle, which can cause issues in the ice stage where enemies are on a slightly lower plane than you. Luckily, you can use magic spells to hit the enemies or jump over them with the upgraded green boots. Just like the arcade, you need the Psycho Cannon in order to fight the final boss. This weapon only becomes available in the second loop, and in this version, you need the strongest weapon, the Fireball, and all the gold equipment before the Psycho Cannon becomes available. In my playthrough, I ended up having to die and play level 5 in the second loop numerous times in order to complete my upgrades, as I still didn't have the strongest weapon, helmet, and boots by that time. I imagine that's because I took a lot of hits throughout the game and didn't get all the doors to open. Overall, I liked this version due to the power-up system that was added, but I certainly understand if the arcade purist would dislike this. A lot about what made the arcade challenging has been taken away and replaced with a more casual platformer, more on par with the difficulty of an average NES Super Mario Bros. Game. I think the shield spell kind of breaks the game though, due to the ability to abuse that spell to avoid taking hits in boss fights and pass through difficult sections like the maces that shoot from the walls in a specific pattern on level 5. The graphics are decent, but they stand no chance against the arcade or even the Genesis version. Much of the background detail is gone, and the 8-bit sprites are a little lacking in comparison, but still look very good for the 8-bit generation. It's a gigantic step up from the NES Ghosts and Goblins graphics. There's also not much sprite flicker, which is a little surprising. Arthur controls perfectly, and like the Genesis version, pressing the D-pad in a diagonal direction doesn't stop Arthur in his tracks. Control is very responsive, even though Arthur controls a little differently from the arcade. It will take a little bit of getting used to if you've played other games in the series. Also, even though it's more of a Ghosts and Goblins issue, he doesn't get stuck on ladders, so that's a definite improvement. The music is fine. It's an 8-bit chiptune rendition of the original songs with a decent amount of higher-pitched tones that are pretty common with Master System games. Where the game really fails is in the sound effects. There are almost no effects, and the ones that exist are incredibly weak. If you're looking for a platformer with a moderate level of difficulty, and have gotten frustrated trying to play through the arcade or console versions of other games in the series, this version should satisfy you. On the other hand, if you want something more difficult like the arcade, I'd suggest looking elsewhere. I hope you enjoyed my coverage of Ghouls N Ghosts for the Master System. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then.